In this lab, what we're going to do is we're going to be setting up a web server. We're going to actually be building something that's called a LAMP server. It's something that's often referenced. So LAMP stands for Linux, Apache, PHP, and MySQL. So what we're going to do for Linux is we're going to be using our Ubuntu machine. So I'm just going to open up my Ubuntu machine. I'm going to power that on and get that going. Password's password. Okay, so I'm going to be installing using the apt-get program like I've done previously. So I need to get to a terminal, and I'm going to go app. No, I'm going to do terminal. So from the terminal, what I want to do is I want to install Apache. Apache is going to be our web server. So within Linux, typically people will be running Apache as their web server. So when somebody opens up a browser and they type in www.whatever.com or an IP address, it makes an HTTP request to a server. The server that it's making that HTTP request to needs to be running some form of a web server to host web pages. Windows, typically they'll be using something like IIS, which is Microsoft's Internet Information Services. That's their version of a web server. And within Linux, there's something called Apache. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Apache as our web server. So I'm going to use sudo because I'm going to be installing. I'm using the apt-get, apt-get. I'm going to use install. And what I want to do is I want to install Apache. And I'm just going to do Apache 2. And it's saying if you want to install Apache, we need to install some prerequisites. Do you want to continue? I'm going to say yes. So at this point, we should have a web server. I always test it just to make sure it's working. So I'm just going to open up my Firefox. And on the local machine, I could either type in the local machine's IP address. Otherwise, I could type in localhost, one word. Otherwise, I could type in 127.0.0.1, which is the local loop, which is the same as localhost. So I do see that I've got Apache 2 default page, and I know that at this point it's hosting a web page. So we definitely have Apache installed. So I'm just going to close down Firefox at this point. Okay, so after installing PHP, what I want to do is I want to change my directory, and I want to go to the var. It's /var www. Now, in the older version of Apache, it was just var www, and if you hit enter and you did an ls, you would normally see an index.html page. On the newer version of Apache, there's actually an additional folder here, which is an HTML folder. So if you see the HTML folder, we're going to have to change directory into the HTML folder. And if I do an ls for listing, I see the index.html page. So depending on the version, currently the default web page is located in the var www.html. Within Windows, it's in the inetpub www root. So there's two different folders depending if you're on Windows, if you're on Linux, and even on Linux there's different versions. So you may be in the var www. Basically what you're looking for is the It's Works page, and it's currently with the latest version under var www.its /HTML. So if you get into the HTML folder, you see the index.html, you're in the right spot. So that's where I'm at, and what I want to do is I want to create a PHP page at this point. So by default, normal users cannot write to the var www folder. This area is protected, so we need to be a super user. So I'm going to do the sudo, and I'm going to use gedit, and I'm going to just create a page called test.php. So the test page is just going to be the page that we're going to use to test to see if PHP is installed correctly. The password is password. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do $PHP, question mark greater than. So this is what's called a PHP block. Now, if you wanted to, you could create like traditional HTML tags above the PHP block, or you could do them below the PHP block. But anything that's within the PHP block is all going to be server-side code. So this is going to be what's going to run up on the server. So what I'm going to do, normally the first page I create is a test page, and I create something that uses the PHP info method. So this is basically a shared method that's built into the PHP library. So if you call this, it's going to pull all of the server information and just dump it into this web page. So I'm just calling a method called PHP info, one word, opening and closing parens, that means it's a method, and then a semicolon at the end. So I'm just going to save this document, and I'm going to close this down. I'm going to open up my server, or my Firefox, and I'm going to navigate to my server. So I'm just going to do my local host, and I'm going to do my test PHP page. So I'm just going to type in localhost /test.php and hit enter. And what it does is it just basically puts all of the PHP information out. It lets me know the version, lets me know my operating system, lets me know the build date of when the operating system was built, and any information that you need about the server is dumped into this page. Now, the reason that I like testing this is, one, this would never work if PHP was not installed correctly. This is a library that's being used within PHP, and the only way Apache would be able to use that library is if PHP and Apache were connected correctly. So at this point, I know everything is tied together correctly. So this is perfect. At this point, I know that everything's working correctly. I'm going to grab a screenshot of this because this is going to be something that I'm going to be submitting. So I'm just going to go to my WordPad, and I'm going to grab a screenshot, and I'm just going to put that in here. So this is the first document that I create. It's also the first document that I delete. So after I know that everything's good, I get rid of it. It's a handy method that you can use when you're debugging. So for example, I worked on a customer's website, and they were doing some interactions with FedEx, and they basically wanted to connect their web page with FedEx to check to see if there were any shipping requests, and they could schedule requests, package pickups, and deliveries. So in order to integrate with other third-party vendors like FedEx, I needed a library called curl. And curl didn't appear to be installed on the customer's web server. So I was working as the programmer, so I was writing the application to do the integration, and I kept on getting an error about curl library, whatever. And I emailed the administrator, and I said, it doesn't seem that curl is installed or working correctly. And basically the administrator emailed me back saying, yeah, everything's working good, you've got a problem with your code. So I looked at the code some more and tried it, and I was unable to get it to work. And at that point, I did this PHP info, and I was able to come down here and look at all of the different installed methods, and I was able to see that curl currently was not installed on the server. So I was able to basically take a screenshot showing that curl was not installed, and basically he installed it and emailed me back, said it's working good for me. And then I went and looked and it was installed and my code was working again, so I was happy. So anyways, if you're running into problems and you don't have access to the physical server, this would be one way to find out what's installed and what's not installed. Really, really a handy way to troubleshoot what currently is on somebody else's system. Now, the reason it's the first thing that I delete as well is a lot of people don't delete this. And if I were a hacker and I searched just for PHP info opening closing brackets, I'd get quite a bit of stuff. So I'm just going to quickly do it. I'll just go to Google. And I'm just going to search for PHP info opening and closing brackets. Now, you're going to get a lot of information about PHP info, how to create the PHP info file. But at some point in time, you may get somebody who left their PHP info up. So here's an example. I'm not hacking at this point. I am just information gathering is what the technical term is. They left this web page up. Google indexes the entire world. But I can now see that I've got a web server with a build date of back in May of 08. All right, so we've got some pretty old stuff running here. They're running 4.4 of PHP. We were running 5.5.9. So if I were a hacker, what I would be doing with this information that I gathered is I would start to look at differentiation. So every time a new version of software is released, they give a release info of what was patched and what was fixed and what was updated, what features were added to the latest version. So if I wanted to, I could do a diff between this version and that version, figure out what bugs were fixed, what holes were patched, what vulnerabilities were taken care of, maybe in 4.5, 4.6, 4.7, 4.8, all the way up to 5.5. Then I could start to pinpoint what exploits I could try to take advantage of this other system. So it's a great tool to try to debug and troubleshoot servers, but it's something I would not want to have on my server, because now a hacker can start to scroll through and see all of the different modules that are installed. Maybe some of these modules are vulnerable. I don't necessarily want to give that information out freely. So you want to make sure somebody works for it. You don't want them to just be able to get it by doing a quick Google search. So anyways, we know PHP is installed, it's configured, it's working correctly. So life is good. So right now we've got Linux, yay, that's our Ubuntu. We've got Apache, that's great. We've got PHP installed, which is good. Now we need MySQL. What MySQL is a database server. So in the Microsoft world, they have Microsoft SQL Server. Well, a competitor to that is a more open sourced version called MySQL. So we're going to just install that. I'm going to do the sudo apt-get install, hitting my up arrow key, which I probably should have just typed it in at this point. Okay, sudo apt-get install, and then I want to install the MySQL server. So it's just MySQL-server. Now I word wrapped there just so you can see that. So sudo apt-get MySQL server. I'm going to hit enter. And there are a bunch of prereqs. I'm just going to say yes. And it's going to go through and it's going to do an installation. So it wants a new password for the root user. So what I want you to do what I need you to do is use a password called password. And then I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to repeat it, password, and hit enter. So in the real world, I would never, ever use a password. In the class, we're using password just to make sure we're all on the same page, and if you run into problems, I can troubleshoot your machine. And right now we're working on a project, setting up a database, setting up a web server, setting up PHP. Additional future projects will be built off of this. And some of the future websites that I'm going to be creating are going to be vulnerable, and we're going to be exploiting them. But those websites may need to access your database. So I'm just making sure we all have the same password. So at this point, I think we're good. We've got PHP installed. We've got MySQL installed. I do want to install one more thing. There's actually a library that bridges in between PHP and MySQL. So I'm going to install that. So I'm just going to hit my up arrow, sudo apt-get install, and then it's going to be called PHP5, and then it's going to have a hyphen, and it's going to be MySQL. So sudo apt-get install PHP5 hyphen MySQL. So I'm just going to run this. And at this point, we're good. So what this did is it installed some libraries and some different things that we need to help facilitate communication between our PHP document and our database. So we installed the database. This is just the bridge between PHP and the MySQL database server. So what I want to do is I want to just log in to the MySQL server and see if we can connect. So from the prompt, I'm just going to type in MySQL. Oops, got to make sure my cursor's in here. MySQL. And I'm going to do a -u for user. Username is root, R-O-O-T. And then a -p. They don't let me type in the password because they're afraid people will be standing behind you and see the password, which is very valid. So they just leave it blank. So it's MySQL space -u space root space -p. I'm just going to hit enter after the p, and it's going to prompt me for my password, which is going to be password. I'm going to hit enter, and now my prompt is different. Now I've got a MySQL prompt, which is kind of cool. The MySQL prompt lets me do all the SQL commands that I would normally do. So SQL stands for Structured Query Language. It's a language built to help retrieve data from a database, insert data, organize data. So it's a data language. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to create a brand new database. So I'm just going to use the keyword create. And it's going to be database. And the database I want to create, and it's important that we all create the same database, it's going to be called web server, one word, with a semicolon at the end. So it's create database web server. And the web server is one word. So I'm going to hit enter, and yeah, it created our database for us. So now what I want to do is I want to tell it that anytime I write any type of SQL, I want you to write that SQL for web server. So I'm going to just type in use web server semicolon, and the database was changed. So now if I do a select or a create or an insert or a delete, it will always be using the database that we just created. So what I need to do is I need to get some SQL. Instead of writing all of this SQL from scratch, I actually put together an SQL document for you. So I'm going to connect up to a CD. So I'm going to come up here and go to my CD-ROM, and I want to connect to an ISO image on a data store. T underscore ISO images. I've got my ethical hacking in here. Inside the ethical hacking folder, I've got a websites folder. And in there I've got a website ISO. So I'm going to go to the website ISO. It may pop open the window automatically. If it doesn't, you'll have to come over here and then go down to the CD-ROM. But I do see I've got my webserver.sql file here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that file. I got to come up here and drag this down. I'm just going to drag this document onto my desktop. So I'm just putting the document onto my desktop from the CD. I've got other websites in here that we're going to be using for future projects, so they're vulnerable websites. So what I did is, you don't have to open this, I just want to show you. I'm creating a table that's got a bunch of fields in it, and then I'm inserting a whole bunch of data, just garbage data, into that table. So this is just saving us a lot of time. So for some future websites, the website's going to need data, so that way we can do things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting and all that kind of stuff. So in order to do that, I need some data to play with. So what we're going to do is we're just going to fill our database with this SQL. So there's a keyword called source. And after source, I'm going to do a /home. I did a space after source. So it's source space /home /student / desktop with capital D /web server .sql. So basically, I'm just telling the database, load all of the queries written inside this SQL document. That's what I'm doing. And I'm just pointing the source to the SQL document that's got the create tables and all of the inserts. I don't want us to do that by hand, so I created a file to automate that. So I'm going to hit enter, and I see that 36 rows have been added. So that's awesome. I'm going to just grab a screenshot of that. And I'm just going to paste that in here. So at this point, I can see that you've got a web server set up. I can see that you've got PHP set up. I can see you've got MySQL set up. And I can also see that you've loaded the MySQL server with a bunch of data. So all of that is just great. I don't want to close that yet. So at this point, really we're done setting up the web server. I do want to take a couple minutes and just talk a little bit about the paragraph at the end. So at the bottom of your Word document, please write a short paragraph describing the benefits of installing PHP on a Linux system. What are some of the drawbacks of installing PHP on a Windows server? Okay, so here's my rule. When I'm installing software, I try to install the software on the operating system that it was really meant to be used on. Now, some applications are cross-platform. So for example, I could install PHP on Windows, and I can use PHP running within IIS. Sometimes you have to do it. For example, here at the college, we're a Windows operating system shop. Everything is Windows. So originally I was told, well, you're going to be teaching PHP, and we need to have a PHP server so that way students can write PHP. So I went to the IT staff and I said, hey, we would like to run a PHP class and we need to have a PHP server. In order to do that, can we get a Linux box? And they said, no, we don't have any Linux boxes, and we're not going to hire somebody to support Linux, so you can't do that. Well, we still need to teach PHP. So what we did is we installed PHP on a Windows box, and students within the web course are writing PHP, and it's being served up within a Windows environment. Now it works fine, everything works great. Here's the deal. When I stay vanilla. When I do everything the way that Microsoft wants me to do it, life is a little bit easier. So for example, in the real world, if I had a customer and they were a Windows shop, I wouldn't even offer PHP. I'd say, well, let's just do it in ASP.NET. That's the language that works best on Windows. So ASP.NET will run an IIS, and it uses the .NET framework. If there's any vulnerabilities within IIS, or if there's any vulnerabilities within the .NET framework, or within ASP.NET, Microsoft Windows Update will automatically patch any of those vulnerabilities. So when you're running Windows Update, anything Microsoft related will be patched. So that's a huge benefit. Now, if I have a Windows machine and I install Apache, Microsoft doesn't care. They will not update Apache. They will not patch Apache. They won't fix it. If I have PHP, even if I'm not using PHP within Apache and I'm using PHP within IIS, Microsoft doesn't care. It will not update Apache. It will not update PHP. It will not update MySQL. I could run all three of those on a Windows machine, and Windows Update will not fix it. So I, as the administrator who installed MySQL, PHP, or Apache, need to put a little reminder on my calendar to check for updates every so often. And if there's an update, I need to patch it. So for example, here at the college, in between semesters, I need to always make sure that I'm running the latest version, because if I'm out of version, I'm out of date, and it is vulnerable and it can be compromised. So it's now my burden and my responsibility to make sure those third-party products running on Windows will stay patched and up to date. So on the flip side, if I'm over here in Linux, it's actually really nice. So I'm just going to get out of this MySQL prompt. I'm sitting at the MySQL prompt. I'm just going to type an exit. It says bye. I'm back to my regular. Okay, so that's not what I meant to do. If I do a sudo apt-get apt-get, I can do an update which will update all of the repositories that I download software from. It'll make sure that I've got the latest repositories, that I've got the latest versions. It just updates my apt-get program itself. So at this point, I just updated my apt-get. So I could also do a sudo apt-get upgrade. And at this point, it would go through and it would upgrade all of the pieces of software that I've installed on my Apache system, which is awesome. It's like a one-line update that updates everything. So that's kind of cool. Now, I'm not actually going to run that line, and if you ran the line, don't sweat it. I do know that within the virtual environment, in previous classes, I know that there has been bugs where it updates like a video driver that didn't work with VM, which kind of sucked. So right now I'm not going to run it. If you ran it and you got a black screen, just shoot me an email and I'll fix it for you. But just so you know, in the real world, I run it on a real physical machine. I don't have the problem, and it was really just a one-time issue. That probably isn't a big deal. But I'm just not going to do it, so that way we all stay on the same page. So anyways, that's kind of some of the differences. So Apache is kind of nice because it's running on Linux, and if I just create a scheduled task to an upgrade every so often, it'll automatically upgrade my Apache, my MySQL, and my PHP. So that's one reason that I stick and I try to keep each software package running on its native operating system that it was designed for. So anyways, hopefully that helps kind of clarify some of the server software and some of the complexities that come with installing like PHP on Windows. If you are going to go down that road, it can be very difficult. All right, so if you want to install like WordPress on a Windows machine, it's not the easiest thing, but Microsoft realized that they will lose the game if they keep it hard. So Microsoft released the Windows Platform Installer, WPS, Windows Platform Installer, will be a software package you can install on your server. And what it is basically it's a Windows version of the apt-get program that we're using here on Linux. So I could say I want WordPress, and then it'll say, okay, well, you're going to need to install, the fast CGI connectors. You're going to have to install PHP. You're going to have to, do all of these different packages. Do you want to do all of them first? You're going to say yes, and it'll do it all. So that's made it a little bit easier. It's definitely not as nice as apt-get, but just a heads up. So there's different options there. So anyways, we installed a LAMP server. Everything's up and going, and we are all prepared to move on to future labs. So hopefully you found this video useful.